So this week we're going to be talking about educational tests. And again, we're simply going through the process of looking at each type or broad category where we find testing and assessment used in modern society. So obviously, achievement tests and aptitude tests have become a major part of our educational system. These are both based on a genuine desire to gauge success of interventions. So a lot of times testing may feel like it is a measure directed at basically targeting the student. But most of the time, most educational tests are also being used to determine how successful is the actual intervention. And the intervention in this case is the actual teaching. It's the slides, it's the lectures, it's the discussions. Is this actually working at getting the information across to the students? So not only are individual students being assessed to determine if they're successful in these classes, these tests are also being used to gauge how successful the class or the instructor themselves are. So a lot of things are actually being analyzed and examined with educational tests. And that's simply within a single class. Also, universities, school systems are often being evaluated across the board on these tests, and also looking at performance. So you may have heard things like top 5 schools in the area. This is often determined through the success of testing. So when we're looking at educational tests, though it is a easy thing to think about, it actually covers a broad number of tests and a broad number of purposes of those tests. We're going to basically broadly break it down into achievement tests, which are generally the tests that you're most familiar with on a day-to-day basis. That's your weekly quiz, that's your test every 4 weeks. It's looking to see, are you actually learning the information being provided in the class? Aptitude tests are more about where are you actually at, broadly speaking. So if we're wanting to look at to see, for example, if your reading level is up to snuff, we can give a reading level test. If we're interested in determining would you be successful in a college setting, we can give an aptitude test. A graduate program, we can give that aptitude test. So we're going to basically see that there's 2 broad categories, though often they're answering similar questions just at different levels. So as I said, a lot of tests are actually response to intervention tests, RTIs. And the idea behind a response to intervention test is that it's basically to label that the test itself, though it may be used to basically make a summative judgment about the person's success, is also being used to examine the classroom environment itself, how groups of learners are working within that environment, and individual levels, with the idea of potentially changing the interventions. So it's a multi-level prevention framework applied in educational settings that's designed to maximize student achievement through the use of data and identify students at risk. So for instance, if I was doing a class and everyone was getting below a C, that might indicate that there's something wrong with the interventions that I'm doing. I may want to look at the testing. I may want to look at the information I'm providing. I may want to change the interventions. So generally speaking, when we're looking at a response to intervention style test, we're looking at multiple levels. We're looking at the classroom environment. So how is the entire classroom doing? We're then looking to see, are there small groups of learners that have failed to make the adequate progress in the classroom if the classroom itself is doing well? And finally, we may want to think about individual tailored or administering instruction for students. In other words, tailoring for specific students that are falling behind. So the RTI model aims to accelerate the learning process for all students, as well as identifying students with learning disabilities. So is the class working? Is the class working for everyone? And is there anything that I can do to individually help students perform better? That's basically what we're talking about with RTI. Now, there are other types of frameworks when we're looking at educational testing. Dynamic assessment is one, where again, we're kind of going through the process of not just assessing whether the student is succeeding, but also asking the question, how is the instruction functioning? So whenever we're doing educational assessment, we do need to be looking at the potentials of bias in measurement. And the bias in measurement is a difficult question here, because is it legitimate differences between groups, or is it a bias? In other words, are the tests themselves biased towards a group? And that's both questions that need to be asked. For example, gender. Males tend to outperform females, but not at all times and all levels. Females tend to actually, and again, we're talking about a biological male versus female here, not necessarily gender roles, but gender as an actual sex assignment. We do find that there are, across those groups, differences in development. And at different times through the development, as we go from preschool to kindergarten to early grades to later grades, we typically find differences in performance based on this that may or may not be directly related to how they're being tested. However, as we start to see actual differences in performances at higher levels, high school, college, etc., we actually tend to see males outperforming females on a lot of these achievement tests, which may also indicate that there's some bias, that a lot of these tests are being created by males and may slightly favor kind of a male viewpoint. When we look at ethnicity, we'll find differences. Whites tend to perform better than other groups, except Asians on math, and this is again a broad example. Now, I do want to make a really strong note here that when we look and find gender and ethnic differences in educational testing, these differences are usually looking at broad groups, and they're also generally fairly small. However, they may be an indication of, again, we need to ask the question, is this a legitimate difference between ethnicities in what we're actually wanting to test, the construct involved, or is it a byproduct or a bias in the types of testing? And again, when we think about a lot of the tests that are being designed, they're being designed by white, highly educated men that are speaking English. So those may be introducing biases that are capturing these differences. We also definitely find cultural differences. One of the largest is economically disadvantaged. So we do tend to find that children and even adults that are from a much more economically advantaged group tend to perform better on most educational measures, whether it's achievement or aptitude. And likewise, one of the bigger predictors of kind of poorer performance on these tests is, again, economically disadvantaged. Poor language skills tend to make students appear less knowledgeable, so almost all of these achievement and aptitude tests are based on some form of communication. So if someone is actually struggling with communication, it tends to cause a halo effect again that may actually make them appear on the test to be not performing as well as they might if they were given the information in different forms. We also tend to find behavioral differences based on region, so even within regions of the country. And again, if we look at this, a lot of times the economic disadvantaged and language skills are the bigger determinants of differences. But above and beyond that, we also tend to find based on region, which may also reflect quality of school systems. Also, the knowledge based on region. So again, sometimes tests are created in one region that are used in others. So if you think about a test that was written in New York City, many of the word problems may be referencing urban settings. If that same test was then given in a very rural setting, there's some of the students may actually just not have a connection to what those word problems really are about. Now, the problem may still be the same problem. It may still be something that you can figure out regardless of your familiarity, but it's still going to cause a bias in the test, where some students in urban settings very much feel comfortable with the item, while other students in, let's say, a more rural setting may have to actually kind of think more deeply about what is the question actually asking because they don't have that reference point. So within educational settings, there has been a strong focus on creating, or basically creating, cultural fair tests. So culturally loaded tests incorporate concepts associated with the culture. There's an example, the cultural regional upper crust savvy test is an example of a culturally loaded test. It's made to actually measure cultural differences. There's also the Black's Intelligence Test of cultural homogeneity. So basically, this is an idea of trying to find out, is there differences between different ethnicities within testing based on their culture. This was designed by Williams in 1975. However, most of the focus has been at creating more culturally fair tests, minimizing the influence of culture in test contents. And one of the ways we look at this is if I give a test and I look at subgroups and I find differences in performance, that is not an automatic guarantee there's bias in the test, but it does raise a red flag. So Cattell, as early as 1940, created the culturally fair test of intelligence in an effort to remove kind of educational components and also cultural, think urban versus rural, references to the items being asked. And even more so is the Raven Progressive Matrix, which is an aptitude test aimed at actually cognitive ability that has no verbal component. It is all visual. The very first version of this was in 1938. I have here that the current edition is 1998. Honestly, it's probably been updated since then. I need to check that. But it is still in use today. In fact, it's often used both in educational settings. It's also sometimes used when cognitive ability is a part of a job performance because of its cultural sensitivity. So when we're thinking of the levels of analysis of social justice, we need to recognize that there are multiple levels going on. There is the macro level, where cultural, stereotypes, social economic status all impact abilities of people to perform. And this is something well beyond the individual. So what culture you're born into, what stereotypes are around you based on your ethnicity, and the SES that you're in. So, and again, that's social economic status. It's basically a way of trying to measure not just how much money you have, but also how much support and how much focus there is on education. So social and economic status. Sociology and political science really looks at these kind of effects at the macro level. And these are cultural effects that are occurring throughout our society. At the meso level, or specifically kind of the mid level, is organization and groups. So Indiana University is an example of an organization. If you work for a company in Indianapolis, that would be an example of an organization. Your high school was an organization. So social psychology, IO, community and health psychology tend to look at this level. This can also be your community. So not necessarily the culture that you live in, but the culture of the community that you're in. And this can be, for example, the difference between rural and urban. And finally, there's the micro level. Cognitive psychology tends to focus on this, so does clinical psychology. This is how all of those other effects are affecting your performance. So when you think about it, there's actually an enormous number of strata or layers that are occurring that we need to incorporate and think about within our testing. Generally speaking, most efforts to make culturally bias-free tests is focused on the micro level. It's not trying to change the culture or the stereotypes. It's not trying to even change the communities or the organizations. It's trying to make sure that we remove those effects from the testing if we're testing an individual, the person, you. So let's talk about educational tests in general. So an intro to educational tests. Achievement tests purport to measure knowledge already attained. So whenever we're talking about trying to determine if someone learned something, so your typical tests or quizzes in a class, these are achievement tests. Typically used in primary and secondary school, assesses performance of students on a multiple components, and it's usually compared to some form on a national norm. So generally speaking, there are expectations that if you've completed a certain amount of education, you should have a certain amount of skills. A good example of this is reading level norms. So if you're in the 8th grade, is your reading at the 8th grade level? That would be an example of comparing your achievement to a national norm. Aptitude tests attempt to predict future achievements, typically used in entrance exams to colleges and grad schools, predict success in college, grad schools, law schools, medical schools, and again is generally based on national norms. These can also be used for more prestigious private schools. So in order to get access to these schools, you may also have to take some type of aptitude test to make sure that you are someone that is going to succeed in that environment. Now, a lot of people look at these tests as basically barriers, keeping people out. But at the same time, if the test is well made, the idea here is we're wanting to find people that will actually succeed. It is to no one's benefit to let everyone into a tough program that a lot of people will fail without trying to predict whether they'd be successful or not. That is not necessarily an elitist attitude, that's just a recognition that people differ. And that if someone is very apt at artistic skills, but is trying to get in an engineering program and has no math skills, they're basically going to waste their time, money, and fail. So we'd want to look at that beforehand. Do you have the mathematical skills to succeed in engineering? And likewise, if you were trying to get into a prestigious art or creative design program, we'd want to make sure that you have those personality traits and those abilities to do well in that program. If you were very concrete in your thinking, not very imaginative, and tended to be very focused on numbers, you would also probably fail in a fine arts program. So when we're thinking about aptitude tests, we're really talking about trying to basically match the person with the environment for success for both of them. So one of the earliest examples of an aptitude test is the ASVAB, the Armed Services Vocational Aptitude Battery. It is a group test based on the Army's original alpha and beta test. It's intended to help test takers learn about their interests, abilities, and personal preferences in relation to their career opportunities in the military. So the purpose, again, of this, when we think about any test, we should start thinking about the stakeholders. So one of the stakeholders is the test taker. So what is the test taker getting out of this? They're getting information about their interests, their abilities, and their personal preferences. But there's other stakeholders. For example, there's the U.S. military. What the military is getting out of this test is a good idea of how these very individuals will perform in different MOSs, or basically specialties within the military. So if someone has a strong aptitude towards engineering, it might suggest combat engineering. If someone has a strong mechanical interest, it might indicate that this person would be good as a mechanic working on the various vehicles. If someone's really good with small parts and mechanical engineering, it might also suggest weapons maintenance. These are all examples of how this test can help basically the decision makers decide where someone should actually fit well and where the training would be best served. The ASVAB is made available to many high school students, and a lot of people that are going to the military obviously take this, but also some people just take it to learn about themselves. So the ASVAB is normed every year on ages 16 to 23, so that means that the expectations of your percentage performance is not based on people that took the test 50 years ago. It's based on people that took the test last year. Offered either individually or in groups, and the Armed Forces Qualification Test is a subset test used to assess recruitment into the military. So if you took the AFQT, it's a shorter form for someone that's simply joining the military without having already taken the ASVAB. The aptitude subtests assess aptitudes for 5 careers: clerical work, electronics work, mechanical work, skilled technician, and combat operations. So again, each one of these is going to be a categorical skill that's tested, and then we're going to have a percentage score rank. So if you're in the 93rd or higher percentile, you're considered your AFQT is 1. So for example, if I took this test and found out that I was not very good at clerical work, I might be scheduled as 3A in the 50th to 64th percentile. If I took it and was actually very good at electronics, I might be category 1, mechanics category 2, skilled technician maybe category 2, combat operations maybe again a 3A. I don't know. I haven't actually taken this test. This is just giving you an example of how the raw scores are being then categorized into groups. So if someone has a level 1, that is basically suggesting that they would be have a very strong aptitude to learning in that area. So the Armed Force Qualification basically looks at arithmetic reasoning to numerical operations, word knowledge, and paragraph competition, with general aptitude subtests looking at general technical, general mechanical, electronic, motor mechanical, science, combat operations, and skill technical. There are other tests that were out there that are used regularly, and one of them is one of the very first tests that you're given before you're even aware. So when you're born, you're probably being given by your hospital the APGAR birth checklist. It looks at heart rate, respiration, color, muscle tone, and reflex irritability. And it's basically on a point system. So 0 means it's absent, 1 means that there is a little bit of a response, and 2 means the accepted response. So generally speaking, a child is born with an APGAR score of 0 to 3, they're considered severely depressed as far as their actual initial cognitive and behavioral function, and are most likely going to be looking at very special care, maybe intensive care initially. Moderately depressed is 4 to 6. It depends if that quickly improves, and excellent condition is a 7 to 10. And again, one of the things we often talk about is some of these are just initial tests. So we look at, for example, respiration. Vigorous crying would be 2 points. If we look at appearance, completely pink would be 2 points. If we look at grimace, active motion, coughing, pawing, etc., would be 2. Pulse over 100 would be, again, a 2. And activity, active motion, is a 2. So there's also the Connors rating scale. Parents answer questions about child's activities on social relation and school performance. And again, this is often given to parents for children that are younger than able to actually complete self-report. So these are examples of observational tests being done by others to basically assess how we're doing from birth through early education. So Aschenbach's child behavior checklist is another example. It looks at aggression, depression and anxiousness, attention, delinquency, social, somatic, thought, and withdrawal. It's used to identify at-risk children. And it should be noted that most of our preschool assessments are not necessarily strongly predictive of long-term performance. For example, a child may be aggressive and attention-seeking at a very young age, but that doesn't necessarily represent that that's how they're going to be as adults. Generally speaking, when we're talking about personality traits, these do not become stable until later, late childhood, early adulthood. But these can be used again to look at-risk children for potential interventions. So documented difficulty in psychological, social, or academic areas for purposes of intervention. So compared to other children his or her age, how well does your child, again, get along with brothers and sisters? Worse, average, better. Get along with other kids. Behave with his or her parents. Play or work alone. And again, this is then scored to look for these differences and to basically, again, this is an aptitude test looking for potential issues that could be possibly intervened on early, resulting in a better outcome. So preschool assessment, age 2 is usually the best age for these kind of first assessments. They do require some observation. They do require the child to be somewhat mobile and to starting to have social interactions. The test considerations, they're generally short durations, an hour or less of observed behavior. There are actually assessments that the children themselves can take that are usually colorful and engaging and attention maintaining. And again, they're best used to identify extremely deficient or extremely gifted children. In other words, if we have a preschool assessment that we're giving children at age 3 that indicates the child is slightly above average, that really is not very predictive of long-term performance again. Children change greatly as they develop in these early years. However, if the test showed them in the high upper 99th percentile, in other words, truly a gifted child, we may actually expect to see that child be gifted throughout their lives. And likewise, if someone scores very low on these tests, it may be an indication that they need a lot of interventions to make sure that they don't fall behind.